17 million people live in a country half the size of Ireland, where a quarter of the land sits below sea level and would flood without the constant pumping of water that has been the Dutch obsession for 1,000 years. The Netherlands is a nation that created itself from the sea through engineering so ambitious that it reshaped coastlines and built entire provinces on land that was underwater within living memory. A country where bicycles outnumber people, where tolerance is tested daily by immigration and integration debates, and where wealth was built first on spice trade and colonialism, then on flowers, finance, and the port of Rotterdam that handles more cargo than any other port in Europe. The windmills are real, but mostly decorative now. The tulips are genuine, but were originally Turkish. And the liberal reputation is accurate, but complicated by right-wing politics gaining ground in a society that is far more divided than its progressive image suggests. Subscribe to Passport Unfolded and discover the Netherlands beyond the canals and coffee shops. The capital contains 900,000 residents in the city proper and over 2 million in the metropolitan area that spreads across the polder in concentric rings of development dating from the 17th century Golden Age to the post-war suburbs. The canal belt is UNESCO listed, with the semicircular waterways and narrow houses creating the image that defines Amsterdam globally. While the Anne Frank House draws over 1 million visitors annually who find the experience emotionally powerful but logistically frustrating as the queue extends down the block. In the red light district operates openly with sex workers in windows and tourists taking photographs despite repeated requests not to. And the coffee shops selling cannabis create the permissive image that attracts visitors and annoys residents who increasingly want their city back from the bachelor parties and cruise ship crowds that have turned Amsterdam's tolerance into a spectacle. Rotterdam was flattened by German bombing in 1940 and rebuilt as a showcase of modern architecture, where experimentation is encouraged and the results range from brilliant to baffling. With the Erasmus Bridge spanning the Nieuwe Maas, earning the nickname the Swan and the Markthal, arching a residential building over a food market whose ceiling is covered in a mural of oversized fruits and vegetables. The port of Rotterdam handles over 400 million tons of cargo annually as Europe's busiest port and the economic engine that funds much of the Netherlands. Stretching 40 kilometers along the river in an industrial complex of enormous scale. The city lacks the charm of Amsterdam, but offers the energy of a place still defining itself rather than preserving what it was. With a population that is among the most diverse in the Netherlands and a food scene that reflects influences from Suriname, Turkey, Morocco, and Indonesia, in combinations unique to Rotterdam. The Hague is the seat of government, despite not being the capital, housing the parliament, the royal palaces, and the International Court of Justice at the Peace Palace, in an arrangement that creates a political importance Amsterdam as capital doesn't have. The Mauritshuis Museum displays Vermeer's Girl with a pearl earring in a collection that concentrates Dutch Golden Age painting in a historic mansion. While the Binnenhof complex contains the parliament buildings around a courtyard that has been the center of Dutch political power since the 13th century. The city ranges from the wealthy diplomatic quarter to the working-class Schilderswijk, one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the Netherlands. And the beach at Scheveningen is the city's summer playground, where the North Sea is cold, but the atmosphere is warm. Utrecht sits at the geographic center of the Netherlands with 360,000 residents and the tallest church tower in the country. The Dom Tower, at 112 meters, which stands detached from the cathedral since the nave collapsed in a storm in 1674 and was never rebuilt, leaving a square where the church once stood in one of the more peculiar architectural arrangements in European ecclesiastical history. The canal system in Utrecht is unique, with wharf cellars at water level that once stored goods and now house restaurants and cafes, giving the waterways a two-level character that Amsterdam's canals lack. The university gives the city a young population and the energy that students bring. While the railway station is the busiest in the Netherlands, with trains departing every few minutes in all directions, making Utrecht the transportation hub that connects the entire Randstad megalopolis. Eindhoven was built by Philips, the electronics company founded here in 1891 that grew to employ a third of the city's population at its peak. And though the company has since moved much of its manufacturing elsewhere, the legacy remains in the design culture, the technical university, and the Strijpes district, where former Philips factories have been converted to creative industries, restaurants, and cultural spaces in successful urban regeneration. The city is modern and functional, rather than historic and picturesque. With the bombing in World War II and post-war reconstruction, leaving little of the old center intact. But the Van Abbe Museum displays modern and contemporary art in a collection that is genuinely challenging rather than simply pleasant. Dutch Design Week takes place here every October, and ASML. And the world's sole manufacturer of extreme ultraviolet lithography machines essential to advanced chip production is headquartered nearby. making the Eindhoven region arguably the most strategically important technology cluster in Europe. Maastricht is the southernmost major city, sitting between Belgium and Germany at the point where the Netherlands extends south in a narrow corridor. And the city is 1,000 years older than the Dutch state, with Roman ruins and medieval walls predating the country's independence by centuries. The Vrijthof Square is lined with cafes and dominated by the Sint-Servaas Basiliek, the oldest church in the Netherlands. While the city gave its name to the 1992 Maastricht Treaty that established the European Union and laid the groundwork for the euro. And the location makes Maastricht culturally distinct from the north, with the dialect, the food, and the atmosphere feeling more Flemish or German than Dutch. And the hills around the city are the only real elevation in the Netherlands outside the southern provinces. Groningen is the largest city in the northern Netherlands with 200,000 residents, of whom roughly half are students at the university that has shaped the city since 1614, giving it an energy that defies its northern isolation. The Martinitoren Tower rises 97 meters above the Grote Markt, with views extending to the Wadden Sea coast. And the Groningen Museum on the canal displays modern art in a building designed by Alessandro Mendini that is as much sculpture as architecture. The city is bicycles even by Dutch standards, with the student population cycling everywhere, regardless of weather, in a commitment to car-free living that urban planners worldwide study. The gas extraction in the surrounding province caused earthquakes that damaged thousands of buildings and created a political crisis. With the Groningen gas field finally being closed in 2023 after years of protests. Delft is the small city between The Hague and Rotterdam that is famous for the blue and white pottery produced here since the 17th century. With the Royal Delft factory offering tours showing traditional hand-painting techniques that have changed remarkably little in 300 years. The Nieuwe Kerk contains the tomb of William of Orange and serves as the burial place for the Dutch royal family. So while the Oude Kerk leans slightly due to subsidence in the peat soil beneath the city. Vermeer was born, lived, and died in Delft, and though the city contains no original paintings, the Vermeer Centrum explains his technique, while every souvenir shop sells reproductions of Girl with a Pearl Earring. The canals and market square create an atmosphere that is quieter and more manageable than Amsterdam, while retaining the same caliber of historic architecture. Leiden is a university city whose institution, founded in 1575, is the oldest in the Netherlands and has produced 16 Nobel laureates. While the city itself is the birthplace of Rembrandt and the site where the Pilgrim Fathers lived before sailing to America in 1620. The Botanical Garden, established in 1590, was one of the first in Europe. All with tulips being cultivated here after their introduction from Turkey, and the canal network and windmill De Valk create picturesque settings that attract fewer tourists than Amsterdam despite comparable beauty. The city suffered a siege during the 80 Years' War, with the relief in 1574 being commemorated annually on October 3rd with herring and white bread, in a tradition that connects the modern city to its role in Dutch independence. Haarlem sits just west of Amsterdam and serves as the capital of North Holland province, with the Grote Markt dominated by the Sint-Bavokerk, where the 10-year-old Mozart played the organ in 1766 on an instrument that remains one of the finest Baroque organs in the world. The Frans Hals Museum displays works by the 17th century portrait painter in a former almshouse. And while the Tailors Museum, founded in 1784, is the oldest museum in the Netherlands, displaying art, natural history, and scientific instruments. The city centre retains its historic character with shopping streets and canals, creating an atmosphere quieter than Amsterdam, while offering most of the same architectural appeal. And the beaches at Zandvoort and Bloemendaal are accessible by train, making Haarlem a base for both urban and coastal exploration. Giethoorn is the village in Overijssel, built on peat bog islands, connected by bridges where waterways replace streets in the oldest section, and thatched roof farmhouses along narrow canals have made it internationally famous as the Venice of the Netherlands, despite having a permanent population of only 2,600. Tourism has transformed the village from agricultural community to day trip destination, with boat rentals and restaurants catering to the hundreds of thousands who visit annually in crowds that can make life difficult for residents who feel their village has become a theme park. The experience depends entirely on timing, with early morning or late afternoon visits revealing the genuine quietness and beauty that the midday tour groups obliterate, and the surrounding Weerubbenweiden National Park offers wetlands and cycling paths that receive almost none of the tourist attention, despite being arguably more beautiful than the village itself. Kinderdijk is the UNESCO World Heritage Site, where 19 windmills built in the 1740s stand along the polders. Representing the Dutch water management system at its most photogenic, and demonstrating the engineering that has kept this low-lying area dry for centuries. The mills are no longer the primary drainage system, having been supplemented by modern pumping stations. But they remain functional and are operated during summer for visitors who arrive by bicycle along the dike path that provides views of the windmills reflected in the water on calm mornings. Several mills are open to visitors, and one has been converted into a museum, showing how the miller and his family lived in the cramped interior where the machinery occupied most of the space, and the living quarters were arranged around the rotating shaft in conditions that were noisy, drafty, and genuinely uncomfortable by any standard. The Keukenhof is the flower garden near Lisse that opens for 8 weeks each spring when 7 million tulip bulbs bloom across 32 hectares of landscaped gardens that are replanted entirely each year, according to designs that change with every season. The garden exists primarily as a showcase for the Dutch flower industry, the largest in the world, which exports billions of euros worth of cut flowers and bulbs annually from the ALKMAAR flower auction, where 20 million flowers change hands every day. The crowds during peak bloom in mid-April are enormous, with paths becoming congested. Though visiting on weekday mornings reveals the beauty that the weekend crowds obscure. And the tulip fields surrounding Keukenhof are equally impressive and freely accessible by bicycle on routes through the bulb region. The ZAANSE SCHANS is the open-air museum near Zaandam where historic windmills, wooden houses, and traditional workshops preserve the industrial history of the Zaan region, which during the 17th and 18th centuries was one of the most heavily industrialized areas in the world, with over 600 windmills powering sawmills, paper mills, and oil presses. The site is free to enter, and the windmills are visible from the path along the river. Though visiting the interiors, the clog factory, and the cheese demonstrations requires individual tickets that accumulate quickly. Over 2 million visitors arrive annually in a site that was originally intended to preserve industrial heritage for educational purposes, but has increasingly become a tourist attraction, where souvenirs and photo opportunities overshadow the technological history. Though the wooden houses are genuine historic buildings, and some are still inhabited by residents who live among the tourists. Volendam is the fishing village on the IJsselmeer that has been performing its own identity for visitors since the 19th century, when artists discovered the photogenic harbour and the residents' traditional costumes, creating a relationship between tourism and tradition that has become inseparable over more than a century. The harbour front is lined with seafood restaurants serving smoked eel and souvenir shops selling wooden shoes. And the entire waterfront functions as a tourist zone that generates the income on which the village depends, since the Afsluitdijk closed the Zuiderzee in 1932 and destroyed the fishing industry that had sustained it for centuries. The traditional costumes are still worn by some residents, particularly older women. Though the practice is declining, and the question of whether the costumes are authentic cultural tradition or tourist performance has no clear answer, because they have been both simultaneously for longer than anyone alive can remember. EDAM is the small town that gave its name to one of the world's most recognized cheeses. Though the cheese marketed globally bears little resemblance to the artisanal product originally produced here and traded at the cheese market that operates Wednesday mornings in summer as a tourist attraction rather than actual commerce. The town itself is charming in the understated Dutch way, with canal-lined streets, drawbridges, and 17th century houses, creating a historic center small enough to explore in an hour, but pleasant enough to spend a morning in. The Grote Kerk contains remarkable stained glass windows from the early 17th century. And the EDAM Museum, in a 15th century merchant's house, displays a floating cellar, a basement built to float on the groundwater rather than resist it, demonstrating the pragmatic Dutch approach to water management at the domestic scale. And ALKMAAR is the cheese city where the traditional cheese market operates every Friday morning from April through September on the Waagplein, with carriers in white uniforms transporting wheels of Gouda and Edam on wooden sledges to the 14th century weigh house in a tradition dating to the 16th century that continues today primarily for tourists, though the cheese being traded is real. The city played a significant role in Dutch history when in 1573 it became the first city to successfully resist a Spanish siege during the 80 Years' War, earning the motto ALKMAAR Victorious in a victory that boosted Dutch morale and contributed to the eventual independence. Beyond the cheese market, the city has a pleasant, historic center with canals and museums, including the Beatles Museum, housed in a former church that contains the largest collection of Beatles memorabilia in the world. An unexpected attraction that draws music fans who combine the visit with the cheese market. Den Bosch, officially S. Hertogenbosch, is the capital of North Brabant and the birthplace of Hieronymus Bosch, whose 15th century surreal visions of heaven and hell predate surrealism by 5 centuries. The Sint-Jans Cathedral is the finest Gothic church in the Netherlands, with flying buttresses unusual in Dutch architecture and over 600 exterior figures, including angels, saints, and grotesque sculptures that reflect the same imaginative world visible in Bosch's paintings. The Binnendieze is a network of canals running partially underground through the city center. Accessible by boat tours that reveal medieval infrastructure hidden beneath modern streets. And the Boschebol is the local specialty, a large cream puff covered in chocolate that is sold in every bakery around the market square and consumed in quantities suggesting the Dutch commitment to caloric density is even more serious than their reputation for cheese. Arnhem is the city forever associated with Operation Market Garden. The September 1944 Allied airborne assault that attempted to capture the bridge over the Rhine and failed in what became known as a bridge too far, leaving the city devastated and the bridge uncaptured. The Airborne Museum at Oosterbeek occupies the former Hotel Hartenstein that served as British headquarters during the battle and tells the story through artifacts, personal accounts, and an immersive experience that conveys the intensity of combat that killed over 1,700 Allied soldiers. The Netherlands Open Air Museum on the city's outskirts is one of the finest in Europe. With over 80 historical buildings from across the Netherlands reconstructed in settings showing how Dutch people lived and worked since 1700, and the city has rebuilt itself as a center for fashion and design, with the only dedicated fashion museum in the Netherlands. Nijmegen claims to be the oldest city in the Netherlands, with Roman origins dating to the 1st century, when Noviomagus served as a military camp on the empire's northern frontier, though Maastricht disputes the title and the debate remains irresolvable. The city hosts the International 4 Days Marches every July, and the world's largest walking event, where over 40,000 participants walk 30 to 50 kilometers daily for 4 consecutive days, culminating in the Via Gladiola procession, where spectators hand gladiolus flowers to exhausted walkers completing their final kilometers. The city was heavily damaged by Allied bombing in February 1944 that killed over 800 civilians in what the Dutch consider among the greatest wartime tragedies on Dutch soil. And the subsequent fighting during Market Garden left the center modern in reconstruction with historical scars deep in collective memory. "20 places across a country built from the sea." If you're discovering the Netherlands beyond the capital's canals, Subscribe to Passport Unfolded, because 15 more cities and towns await where Dutch innovation meets history. ZWOLLE is the capital of Overijssel province, and a Hanseatic League city whose medieval prosperity from trade is visible in the well-preserved centre, where the Sassenpoort Gate from 1409, the Grote Kerk, and the star-shaped fortification plan survive from the period when ZWOLLE was a significant node in the Northern European trading network. The city is surrounded by a canal, following the former moat, with the fortifications converted into parks that ring the center in a green belt, popular with walkers and cyclists. The Grote Kerk contains an Arpschnittger organ, one of the finest Baroque instruments in Northern Europe, still used for concerts. And the city has become known for its food scene, including a Michelin-starred restaurant at Librijé and the largest outdoor book market in the Netherlands, held Thursdays on the Melkmarkt. Amersfoort is the city most Dutch people drive through without stopping, despite it having one of the best preserved medieval centers in the country. With the Koppelpoort, a combined land and water gate from the 15th century, being among the most impressive surviving medieval defensive structures in the Netherlands. The Ons Lieve Vrouwe Toren, at 98 meters, is the third tallest church tower in the country, and was used historically by ships navigating the Zuiderzee because it was visible from great distances across the flat landscape. Piet Mondrian was born here in 1872, and the Mondrian Huis Museum documents his development from figurative painting to the abstract geometric style of primary colors and black lines that became steel and influenced architecture and design globally. As Breda is a North Brabant city that combines military history, Catholic heritage, and a lively student population in a mix that gives it a character distinct from both the Protestant North and the industrial South. The Grote Kerk contains the elaborate funerary monument of Engelbrecht II of Nassau, an ancestor of the Dutch royal family, while the Keukenhof is a courtyard of medieval houses built for religious women that remains among the best preserved in the Netherlands. The city's carnival celebration is among the most elaborate in the country, reflecting the Catholic tradition of the southern provinces, where the three-day festival before Lent fills the streets with costumed revelers and brass bands in collective enthusiasm that the Protestant North views with a mixture of curiosity and bewilderment. Middelburg is the capital of Zeeland, a city whose historic center was almost entirely destroyed by German bombing in 1940 and then meticulously reconstructed using original materials and techniques wherever possible, creating a city that appears genuinely old despite being largely a 20th century rebuild. The Abbey complex, dating originally to the 12th century, houses the provincial government and museums, with the Lange Jan Tower at 85 meters, providing views across Zeeland's landscape of islands, polders, and the Delta Works flood protection. The city's history includes a significant role in the Dutch slave trade, with the Middelburgse Commercie Compagnie being one of the largest slave trading companies in the Netherlands. And the city is increasingly acknowledging this history through exhibits and discussions that confront the wealth in its architecture and its connection to human suffering. Leeuwarden is the capital of Friesland, the province with its own language, its own cultural identity, and the Elfstedentocht ice skating race connecting 11 cities in a 200-kilometer marathon on natural ice that has only been held 15 times since 1909 and not at all since 1997, because the canals haven't frozen sufficiently. The city served as European Capital of Culture in 2018, bringing international attention and investment to a city long overlooked by tourists focused on the Randstad. And the Fries Museum displays Frisian history, including exhibits on Matahari, the city's most famous daughter, whose real name was Margaretha Zell, and who grew up here before reinventing herself in Paris as an exotic dancer and alleged spy, whose 1917 execution remains controversial. The ceramic tile route through the city leads visitors past 11 fountains designed by different artists, incorporating Frisian ceramic traditions into contemporary art. Enkhuizen is a former Zuiderzee port whose prosperity peaked in the 17th century, when it was one of the most important herring fishing towns in the Netherlands and a base for the Dutch East India Company, with the wealth from that era visible in the grand houses along the harbour. The Zuiderzee Museum is the primary reason most visitors come, with the outdoor section recreating a traditional village using over 130 buildings relocated from around the former sea and populated by costumed interpreters demonstrating traditional crafts. The town itself is small enough to feel genuinely quiet outside museum hours, with the harbour, narrow streets, and defensive walls evoking the Golden Age more convincingly than busier cities where modern development has diluted the historical character. Hoorn is another former Zuiderzee trading port, whose golden age wealth produced the grand buildings around the Rodestein Square. Including the Westfries Museum that displays art and artifacts from the period when VOC ships departed here for Asia and the Americas. The city gave its name to Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, and named by navigator Willem Schouten, who rounded it in 1616, and claimed the naming rights for his hometown, connecting a small Dutch harbour to the most fearsome passage in maritime history. The museum addresses the colonial violence that generated the city's wealth in exhibits that are increasingly honest about the darker aspects of Dutch maritime history. And the decline after the Golden Age left the city smaller than it was in the 17th century. With historic buildings surviving because there was no economic pressure to replace them. Gouda is the cheese capital of the Netherlands, with the cheese market operating Thursday mornings from April through August on the Markt, where farmers bring wheels of cheese to be weighed and traded in a tradition continuing in various forms since the 14th century. The Sint-Janskerk contains 70 stained glass windows from the 16th century that are among the finest in the Netherlands. Having survived iconoclasm, French occupation, and 2 world wars through luck and the foresight to remove and hide them during the most dangerous periods. The city is also famous for stroopwafels, the thin waffle cookies filled with caramel syrup invented here in the late 18th century that have become one of the Netherlands' most recognized food exports. Best eaten fresh from the market stalls where they are made on the spot and served warm. Tilburg is the former textile capital of the Netherlands, an industrial city in North Brabant whose wool industry made it a major manufacturing center during the 19th century, before competition from low-wage countries destroyed the industry and left the city searching for a new identity. The reinvention has focused on culture and education, with the Textile Museum preserving industrial heritage while functioning as a working laboratory for contemporary designers, and the DuPont Museum of Contemporary Art, occupying a former wool spinning mill whose industrial scale enhances the viewing experience. The city hosts the largest fun fair in the Benelux every July, a 10-day event attracting over 1 million visitors that reflects the North Brabant tradition of gezelligheid. The Dutch concept of cozy sociability that the southern provinces practice with particular enthusiasm. An Apeldoorn is the royal city on the edge of the Veluwe, the largest continuous nature area in the Netherlands, with the primary attraction being Paleis het Loo, the Baroque palace built for William III in the 17th century that served as the royal family's summer residence until 2004, and has been restored as a museum displaying interiors, gardens, and collections spanning 3 centuries. The Veluwe itself is a landscape of forests, heath, and sand dunes that feels remarkably wild for such a densely populated country, and the Hague Veluwe National Park within it houses the Krullerzemolen Museum with the second largest collection of Van Gogh paintings in the world, alongside a sculpture garden set among the trees. The Appenhuil Primate Park allows visitors to walk among free-roaming monkeys in a concept that was revolutionary when it opened in 1971 and remains one of the most popular animal attractions in the Netherlands. Lelystad is the capital of Flevoland, the youngest province in the Netherlands. Built entirely on land reclaimed from the IJsselmeer in the 1950s and 1960s in the largest land reclamation project in Dutch history, creating a province that didn't exist when many people now living in it were born. The Batavia shipyard displays a full-scale replica of the 17th century Vaux sea ship that wrecked off Australia in 1629 in a voyage ending in mutiny and murder. Built using traditional techniques and serving as both museum and monument to the colonial era. Jan de Oostvaardersplassen Nature Reserve is a controversial rewilding experiment where large herbivores were introduced to reclaimed land and left to manage themselves, with the resulting winter die-offs generating intense debate about animal welfare and whether truly wild nature is possible in a country as managed as the Netherlands. Deventer is a Hanseatic city on the IJssel River, whose medieval trading prosperity produced a historic center of remarkable preservation, with the Bergkwartier neighborhood containing 14th and 15th century buildings that make it one of the oldest intact urban areas in the Netherlands. The city's Dickens Festival, every December, transforms the center into a Victorian Christmas scene with over 900 costumed volunteers performing scenes from Dickens's novels, attracting over 125,000 visitors in the largest Christmas festival in the Netherlands. The Deventer Kurk, a spiced honey cake produced here since the 15th century, is one of the oldest branded food products in the Netherlands. And the annual Boekenmarkt, stretching over 6 kilometers, is the largest book market in Europe, drawing bibliophiles from across the country. Harlingen is the Frisian port city from which ferries depart for the Wadden Islands of Terschelling and Vlieland. And the town deserves more attention than most visitors give it as they rush to catch their boats. because the historic harbour, with its 17th century warehouses, creates one of the most attractive small-town waterfronts in the Netherlands. The town's prosperity came from whaling, fishing, and Baltic trade. And the wealth from those industries produced the grand houses along the Voorstraat and Noorderhaven that visitors walk past on their way to the ferry terminal without realizing they're passing through a place of genuine historical significance. The Wadden Sea is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the experience of wadlopen, or mudflat walking across the exposed seabed at low tide, is one of the most distinctive outdoor activities in the Netherlands, requiring a certified guide because the returning tide can trap the unwary. Scheveningen is the Hague's beach resort, a neighborhood whose character is distinct enough from the diplomatic center that it functions as an independent destination built on the beach, the pier, and the seaside culture that has drawn visitors since the 19th century when sea bathing became fashionable. And the Kurhaus is a grand hotel from 1885 that anchors the seafront and represents the era when Scheveningen was among Europe's most fashionable resorts. Though the modern version is more populist, with fish stalls selling raw herring that the Dutch eat by holding the fish by the tail in a technique visitors find either charming or horrifying. The harbour area has been redeveloped with restaurants and views of the fishing fleet that still operates here. And the pronunciation of the town's name served as a shibboleth during the Second World War when Dutch resistance used it to identify German infiltrators who could not produce the correct sound. Texel is the largest and most visited of the Wadden Islands, accessible by a 20-minute ferry from Den Helder, offering beaches, dunes, forests, and nature reserves in a landscape that feels remote, despite being less than 2 hours from Amsterdam. The Netherlands is 17 million people living on land they created from the sea, maintained through constant vigilance, and organized with an efficiency that other countries admire and occasionally resent. The country is small enough to cross in 3 hours, but diverse enough that the south feels foreign to northerners. And the Frisian language is incomprehensible to Amsterdam residents. While the tolerance that built the reputation is real, but tested by immigration, housing shortages, and the gap between the progressive image and the conservative politics gaining ground. The bicycles, the canals, the windmills, and the tulips are genuine. But they are the surface of a country that is more complex, more interesting, and more conflicted than the tourism materials suggest. Subscribe to Passport Unfolded for more journeys through countries that reward looking beyond the obvious. 35 places across the Netherlands, from Amsterdam to Texel, all real, and all Dutch, all more complicated than expected.